My father forgot I existed every Christmas for 15 years, right up until I bought a $4 million historic manor in Buckhead. Tonight, he showed up on my front porch with a locksmith, my mother, my golden child sister, and her arrogant husband holding a forged lease. "You cannot stop us," he told me. I simply smiled and stepped aside, telling him to watch me. What he did not know was that I had wired the entire property with hidden cameras and had the police and local news anchors waiting in the wings. If you have ever been the family scapegoat who finally decided to bite back, tell me where you are watching from in the comments and hit subscribe. You will definitely want to hear how I ruined their holiday. The heavy thud of a brass drill against solid mahogany echoed through the grand foyer of my new home. It was Christmas Eve, and the temperature outside in Atlanta had dropped to a bitter 30 degrees, a rare, biting cold that seeped through the window panes. I stood completely still in the shadows of the unlit hallway, the cool, imported marble floor beneath my bare feet grounding me. In my hand, my phone screen glowed brightly, displaying the live high-definition feed from the state-of-the-art security camera I had personally mounted directly above my front door. There they were, my family. Preston, my younger sister Jasmine's white husband, was gesturing impatiently at a bewildered locksmith in heavy coveralls. Preston was a failing commercial real estate agent who constantly tried to act like a Wall Street mogul. He wore a tailored overcoat that probably cost more than the locksmith made in a month, his face flushed with unearned authority as he pointed aggressively at my custom deadbolt. Behind him stood Jasmine, shivering in a thin designer jacket that offered zero protection from the wind. She was complaining loudly, her voice piercing through the audio feed, whining about how long it was taking to get inside so she could start measuring the living room for her new furniture. Next to her was my mother, Valerie. She was meticulously adjusting the collar of her heavy mink coat, looking everywhere except at the door being vandalized. She looked bored, thoroughly inconvenienced by the fact that stealing my home was taking longer than 5 minutes. And then there was my father, Calvin. Pastor Calvin, to his congregation of over 10,000 faithful followers. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, projecting an aura of divine entitlement. He was looking up at the grand architecture of my house, as if God himself had reached down from the heavens and handed him the deed. The drill whined a high-pitched scream that reverberated through the empty halls as it bit deeper into the metal lock. I did not panic. At 33 years old, as the founder and CEO of one of the fastest-growing cybersecurity and smart home automation firms in the Southeast, panic was no longer a part of my vocabulary. I had built an empire by anticipating threats and neutralizing them before they could even register on the radar. I walked toward the entrance, my steps silent and deliberate, and gripped the cold brass handle from the inside. Just as the locksmith leaned his full weight into the drill, I unlatched the secondary deadbolt and swung the heavy door wide open. The sudden lack of resistance sent the locksmith stumbling forward. He caught his balance just in time, his eyes wide with shock as he looked up at me. Preston immediately puffed out his chest, stepping in front of the workman to assert his dominance. Calvin did not even flinch. He did not look surprised to see me, nor did he look guilty for bringing a drill to my front door on a holiday. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper, thrusting it toward my face with absolute arrogance. "Pack your bags, Maya," my father commanded, his rich pastoral baritone voice echoing in the freezing night air. "You are trespassing on church property. Preston has the deed transfer right here. You have exactly 1 hour to gather your personal belongings and vacate the premises without a scene." I looked down at the paper he was holding. It bore a fake official seal, a remarkably well-crafted forgery, claiming that this $4 million historic estate had been purchased using funds from Calvin's megachurch, thereby making it the legal property of his ministry. It was an absolute verifiable lie. I had purchased this home entirely in cash, using the legitimate profits from a cybersecurity company I had built from the ground up with my own 2 hands and a brilliant mind. But Preston, desperate to save his sinking real estate career and maintain his lavish lifestyle, had clearly used his shady industry connections to fabricate this document. They were betting everything on Calvin's immense community influence and endless legal resources to bulldoze over my rights. They assumed a single African American woman, even a successful one, would back down rather than fight a beloved community leader in court. I did not scream. I did not raise my voice or defend my ownership. My steady gaze drifted past Calvin and Preston, landing squarely on my mother. Valerie was busy picking an imaginary piece of lint off her sleeve, her eyes deliberately avoiding mine. She looked annoyed, as if my very existence standing in the doorway of my own hard-earned home was nothing more than a minor inconvenience delaying her holiday plans. Seeing her stand there, completely indifferent to the theft of my property, sent a visceral shockwave of memory through my system. Suddenly, I was not a successful tech CEO standing in a Buckhead mansion. I was 18 years old again, standing on the frozen concrete porch of our old suburban house. It had been Christmas Eve then, too. I had worked double shifts at a local diner for 2 grueling years, saving every single dime in a lockbox hidden under my bed to pay for my college tuition. I wanted to study computer science. I wanted to build complex networks and escape the suffocating performative culture of my father's church. But Jasmine, the eternal golden child who could do no wrong, had decided she needed $20,000 to launch a luxury lifestyle brand. Her brilliant business plan consisted of nothing more than putting her name on cheap imported lip gloss and throwing lavish launch parties. Calvin had demanded I hand over my entire life savings to fund her vain venture, claiming it was my duty as the older sister to support Jasmine's vision. When I stood my ground and said no for the very first time in my entire life, Calvin had physically grabbed my arm and pushed me out the front door into the snow. He told me that if I was so independent and selfish, I could survive the winter without his roof over my head. Valerie had stood right behind him in the foyer, adjusting the collar of a different coat, telling me to stop being so dramatic and just give Jasmine the money so we could all have a peaceful holiday. I had spent that Christmas night sleeping in the back of my beat-up sedan in a grocery store parking lot, wrapped in a thin fleece blanket, shivering until my teeth ached. I promised myself in that freezing car that I would never ever be vulnerable to their cruelty again. I swore I would build a fortress they could never breach. Now, 15 years later, they were standing on my porch, trying to enact the exact same violence. Jasmine peeked around Preston's shoulder, a smug, triumphant smile plastered across her perfectly contoured face. "We are going to put a massive Christmas tree right in the center of the foyer," she announced, looking past me into the house as if I had already vanished into thin air. "The lighting in here is going to be perfect for my brand deals." Preston crossed his arms, his arrogant grin matching his wife's entitlement. "We have the legal documents, Maya," he sneered. "Your father is a pillar of this community. Do you really think any judge is going to take the word of an estranged dropout over a respected man of God? You cannot fight us in court. It would drain your accounts and ruin your little tech business. Just walk away quietly and save yourself the public embarrassment." The sheer audacity of their plan was breathtaking. They truly believed I was still that powerless, heartbroken teenager they could bully and discard at their convenience. They thought I would crumble under the threat of a drawn-out, expensive legal battle against a powerful pastor and his well-connected son-in-law. They assumed I would surrender my sanctuary just to keep the peace and avoid a scandal. I looked at the forged lease fluttering slightly in the wind. I looked at Preston's greedy, desperate eyes, Jasmine's spoiled smirk, Valerie's cold indifference, and finally my father's absolute certainty that he owned my life and my assets. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face, the kind of smile that comes when you hold all the cards and your opponent just pushed all their chips into the center of the table. I took a deliberate step back into the grand foyer and swept my arm out in an exaggerated, welcoming gesture, holding the heavy mahogany door wide open. "Come on in, Dad," I said, my voice smooth, melodic, and perfectly calm. "The house is all yours." Calvin's chest swelled with immense pride. He smirked, adjusting the lapels of his suit jacket, fully believing he had just crushed my spirit and stolen my empire with a single forged piece of paper. He stepped confidently over the threshold, his expensive leather shoes clicking loudly against my custom hardwood floors. He was followed closely by Valerie, who finally looked pleased, then Preston, and then Jasmine, who was already pointing at structural walls she wanted to tear down for an open concept look. They marched into my home absolutely victorious, thoroughly convinced they had won the war. They were entirely unaware of the tiny state-of-the-art, red recording lights blinking silently from the custom crown molding in every single room. They were ready to claim their stolen prize and celebrate their dominance. But they had absolutely no idea they had just walked willingly into the most sophisticated, inescapable, and devastating trap I had ever designed. To understand how we ended up in a standoff on my front porch in the freezing cold, you have to rewind exactly 4 weeks to Thanksgiving dinner. The holiday was hosted at my parents' sprawling suburban estate, a house entirely funded by the tithes and offerings of my father's deeply devoted congregation. The dining room air was thick with the scent of candied yams, slow-roasted turkey, and simmering collard greens, but the atmosphere around the mahogany table was anything but warm. My mother Valerie had meticulously arranged the seating chart. She placed herself at the foot of the long table draped in a silk blouse that screamed new money directly across from my father Calvin, who presided at the head like a monarch. Jasmine and Preston occupied the seats of honor right next to my father. And me, I was banished to the very end of the table, seated on a wobbly wooden folding chair right next to the swinging kitchen door. Every time the hired catering staff pushed through to bring out another dish, the heavy wooden door would smack against the back of my chair. It was a physical reminder of exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy, an afterthought squeezed in out of reluctant obligation. I sat quietly pushing a small portion of macaroni and cheese around my gold-rimmed plate, listening to the agonizingly predictable script of our family gatherings. Valerie raised her crystal wine glass, her manicured nails catching the light from the chandelier. "Let us all raise a glass to Preston," Valerie announced, her voice pitching up an octave to ensure everyone in the adjacent living room could hear her. "Vice President of Acquisitions. I always knew my Jasmine married a true visionary. We are just so incredibly proud of you, Preston." Preston leaned back in his high-backed chair, swirling his expensive bourbon with an arrogant smirk. He was a thoroughly mediocre commercial real estate agent who possessed the unearned confidence of a man entirely supported by his father-in-law's influence. I knew for an absolute fact that his new title was completely fabricated. He had not closed a single legitimate commercial deal in over a year. The only reason his firm kept him on the payroll was because Calvin continuously funneled wealthy church members and local business owners his way, effectively buying Preston's career to keep Jasmine happy. "Thank you, Valerie," Preston said, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "It takes a lot of grinding to close these high-level corporate deals, but someone has to keep the market moving." Calvin nodded in solemn agreement, slicing into the turkey with a silver carving knife. He then shifted his gaze down the long table, his eyes landing on me with a familiar look of condescending pity. "And what about you, Maya?" Calvin asked, his voice booming over the clatter of silverware. "Still playing around with those computers in that cramped little apartment of yours? When are you going to get a real job with a pension? You cannot survive on tech support gigs forever." I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, letting the cold liquid cool the familiar burn of anger in my chest. Playing around with computers. That was his definition of my life. He had absolutely no idea that the tech support gig he was mocking was actually a high-level cybersecurity firm I had built entirely from scratch. He did not know about my government contracts, the clearance levels I held, or the fact that my company had just been valued at over $80 million. I kept my wealth strictly hidden from them. I knew exactly what would happen the second they realized I had money. The criticism would instantly transform into entitled demands, and my hard-earned assets would suddenly be reclassified as family resources meant to fund Jasmine's endless vanity projects. "I am doing just fine, Dad," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat and unbothered. "The business is steady." Jasmine let out a sharp, dramatic sigh, dramatically dropping her fork onto her plate. "Well, I wish things were just steady for us," she whined. pouting her lips and looking directly at our father. Our luxury penthouse is just becoming entirely too cramped. Preston needs a proper home office to host his international investors, and my walk-in closet is practically bursting at the seams. It is honestly affecting my mental health. Calvin stopped carving the turkey, his face instantly softening with paternal concern for his golden child. He reached out and patted Jasmine's hand affectionately. "Do not you worry your pretty head about that princess," Calvin said, offering her a conspiratorial wink. "The Lord always provides for those who are faithful. We will make sure you and Preston get into a proper estate very soon. Something with a security gate. You deserve nothing but the best." The blatant hypocrisy was suffocating. 15 years ago, Calvin had thrown me out into the freezing snow for wanting to use my own hard-earned money for a college education. But he was fully prepared to buy his married adult daughter a gated mansion simply because her closet was too small. Before I could formulate a response that would not start a screaming match, my phone vibrated sharply against my thigh. I pulled it out of my pocket and saw the name of my private real estate broker flashing on the screen. It was urgent. We were supposed to finalize the wire transfer for my new property before the holiday weekend completely halted bank operations. "Excuse me, I need to take this," I said, pushing my wobbly folding chair back from the table. Valerie rolled her eyes, scoffing loudly. "Honestly, Maya, taking a call during Thanksgiving dinner? How incredibly rude. It is not like you are closing $1 million deal." I ignored her, grabbing my phone and stepping through the swinging door into the quiet sanctuary of the kitchen. I left my iPad sitting face down on my chair, a rare, careless mistake born out of my rush to answer the broker's call. In the kitchen, the broker delivered the news I had been waiting for all month. The wire transfer had cleared. The deed was officially recorded. I was the sole owner of the historic Wellington estate in Buckhead, a legendary $4 million property, boasting sweeping manicured grounds, a grand marble foyer, and state-of-the-art security. I had paid for it entirely in cash. No mortgage, no banks, no shared ownership. It was my ultimate trophy, the physical manifestation of every tear, every sleepless night, and every sacrifice I had made since being kicked out of my childhood home. I thanked the broker, my heart racing with pure adrenaline, and ended the call. As I turned back toward the dining room, I peered through the small circular glass window in the swinging door. What I saw made my blood run instantly cold. Preston had left his seat of honor. He was standing right next to my folding chair at the end of the table. He had flipped my iPad over. I had forgotten to lock the screen in my rush, and the email application was wide open. Displayed in high definition on the bright screen was the final closing document from my title attorney. Through the glass, I watched Preston's face go completely pale. All the arrogant color drained from his cheeks as he stared at the screen. He knew exactly what that property was. The Wellington estate was the crown jewel of the Buckhead real estate market. Just 2 weeks ago, Preston had been loudly bragging to Calvin about how he was going to secure that exact historic manor for a wealthy commercial developer from out of state. He had desperately needed the massive commission from that sale to cover his mounting debts. Instead, he had been brutally outbid by a mystery buyer who dropped a cash offer that completely blew his client out of the water. Now looking at my iPad, Preston realized the mystery cash buyer was the sister-in-law he despised. The quiet, supposedly struggling tech support worker sitting on a folding chair near the kitchen door had just bought the $4 million mansion he could not even get his clients into. I watched his shock rapidly curdle into something far more dangerous. Pure, unadulterated greed twisted his features. His eyes darted around the dining room to make sure no one was watching him. He quickly tapped the screen, likely forwarding the document to his own phone, before dropping the iPad back onto my chair exactly as he found it. Preston practically sprinted back to his seat next to Jasmine. He leaned in close, his shoulder pressing against hers, and whispered frantically into her ear. I could not hear the words through the heavy kitchen door, but I did not need to. I saw the exact moment the information registered in Jasmine's brain. She sat up stick straight, her eyes widening in disbelief. She looked down the length of the table toward my empty folding chair, her lips parting in shock. Then she looked back at Preston. The disbelief vanished instantly, replaced by a dark, hungry entitlement. They did not look like family members who were happy for my success. They looked like predators who had just discovered a massive unprotected vault of gold. I pushed open the kitchen door and stepped back into the dining room. The moment my shoes clicked against the hardwood, Preston and Jasmine snapped their heads toward me. They quickly plastered on fake tight smiles, trying to pretend they were engaged in casual conversation about the turkey. I walked back to my seat, picking up my iPad and casually locking the screen. I did not confront them. I did not yell or demand to know why Preston was snooping through my private documents. I just sat down and looked directly across the length of the long table, meeting Preston's eyes. He tried to look away, but the predatory hunger was still burning brightly in his gaze. He thought I was just a lucky, naive woman who had somehow stumbled into a pile of money. He thought I was vulnerable. He thought I was weak. In that silent, heavy moment amidst the clatter of silverware and Valerie's endless chattering, the target was officially locked. My family had finally seen my secret, and I knew with absolute certainty they were going to try and take it from me. The very next morning, the silence of my cramped downtown apartment was shattered by a loud and aggressive pounding on my front door. It was barely 8 o'clock on the Friday after Thanksgiving, a time when most people were either sleeping off a heavy meal or fighting crowds at retail stores. I stood in the middle of my small living room, surrounded by half-filled cardboard boxes and rolls of packing tape. For 6 years, I had lived in this fifth-floor walk-up, with its peeling paint, rattling radiator, and unreliable hot water. It was a deliberate choice. I had lived far below my means, hoarding my wealth, reinvesting every single dollar of profit back into my cybersecurity firm, and keeping my family entirely off my scent. They thought I was a struggling tech support worker, and this apartment was the perfect camouflage. But thanks to Preston snooping through my iPad the night before my cover was blown, the pounding echoed again, louder this time, accompanied by the muffled sound of my sister complaining about the smell of the hallway. I tightened the belt of my robe, walked over to the door, and unlocked the deadbolt. Jasmine and Preston did not even wait for me to greet them. The second the door cracked open, Preston pushed his way inside, forcing me to step back to avoid being trampled. Jasmine followed closely behind him, clutching an oversized iced coffee from an expensive cafe and wearing giant designer sunglasses indoors. She wrinkled her nose in absolute disgust as she looked around my modest living space, stepping gingerly over a stack of folded moving boxes, as if they were covered in toxic waste. They looked entirely out of place in my dingy apartment, draped in expensive cashmere and entitlement. "We know what you did," Maya Jasmine announced, dropping her oversized leather handbag onto my small kitchen table with a heavy thud. She crossed her arms, peering over the rim of her sunglasses. "Preston saw the closing documents on your tablet last night. You actually bought the Wellington estate." Preston paced the length of my tiny living room, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He was trying to project the aura of a high-powered executive, but underneath the expensive cologne and the tailored sweater, he just looked manic. He stopped in front of me, adopting a condescending, deeply patronizing posture that he probably used on naive first-time homebuyers. "Maya, I am going to be completely honest with you because I am a professional and you are clearly out of your depth." Preston began, his voice dripping with faux concern. "Buying a property of that magnitude in Buckhead is a massive rookie mistake. You are a single, unmarried woman. What in the world are you going to do with 12 bedrooms and a ballroom? Host video game tournaments? That house is a historical landmark. The maintenance alone will bankrupt whatever little computer business you are running. You have bitten off way more than you can chew." I stood perfectly still, letting him talk. In my line of work, the best strategy is always to let a hostile threat reveal their entire hand before you neutralize them. "Luckily for you, you have family looking out for your best interests," Preston continued, spreading his hands in a magnanimous gesture. "Jasmine and I have been discussing it all night, and we have come up with a win-win solution to save you from this financial disaster. I can take this burden off your hands. We will let you transfer the deed to my name. I need a sprawling, high-profile estate to host my international investors and high-net-worth clients. If I can entertain them at the Wellington Manor, it will secure my position at the firm and guarantee millions in commissions. It is an investment in the family's legacy. Jasmine nodded enthusiastically, taking a loud sip of her iced coffee. Exactly, Maya. It makes perfect sense. I need a house that matches my brand. My social media followers are practically begging for a home tour, and I cannot keep filming beauty tutorials in our luxury apartment. The lighting is terrible, and my walk-in closet is completely full. We are willing to be generous, though. We will give you a sisterly discount. We can pay you $200,000 for the deed, and we will even let you pay it out in small monthly installments, so you do not feel overwhelmed. You can even live in the guest house out back. The sheer breathtaking delusion of their proposal hung in the stale air of my apartment. They were seriously standing in my home demanding that I hand over a $4 million historic estate, a property I had purchased entirely in cash, with my own legitimate wealth for an imaginary fraction of its value, simply to fund their fake lifestyle. They honestly believed they were entitled to the fruits of my labor because Calvin had raised them to believe my only purpose in life was to serve the golden child. I looked at Preston, who was standing there with a smug, expectant grin, fully believing his slick sales pitch had worked. I looked at Jasmine, who was already tapping on her phone, probably picking out custom drapery for a master bedroom she would never sleep in. I let out a sound that I could not contain. It started as a low chuckle in the back of my throat and quickly erupted into full, genuine laughter. I laughed until my chest ached, the sound bouncing off the bare walls of my apartment. Preston's arrogant smile faltered, replaced by a deep, defensive scowl. "What is so funny?" He snapped, his voice losing its smooth, practiced edge. I stopped laughing, wiping a singular tear of amusement from the corner of my eye. My expression dropped into something entirely cold and clinical. I took a step toward Preston, invading his personal space, watching him instinctively shrink back from the sudden shift in my energy. "You think you are a shark, Preston?" I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "But you are just a bottom feeder swimming in a puddle. You think I do not know exactly who you are. I build elite cybersecurity networks for government contractors. Information is my literal currency. You really think I do not know that you have not closed a single commercial real estate deal in 14 months? Preston's face drained of all color. His jaw worked silently, but no words came out. Jasmine lowered her phone, her eyes darting between her husband and me in sudden confusion. I took another step forward, backing Preston toward the front door. "You drive a leased luxury car that is currently 60 days past due," I continued, listing his failures with surgical precision. "Your firm is preparing to terminate your contract by the end of the fiscal quarter because you are a liability who only survives on the pity referrals my father throws your way. You do not have international investors, Preston. You have a mountain of maxed-out credit cards, a fake vice president title, and a credit score that is currently hovering in the mid-fives. You could not secure a loan for a garden shed, let alone buy me out of a $4 million cash property." Preston opened his mouth to defend himself, his hands shaking slightly, but he had absolutely nothing to say. I had completely stripped away his expensive facade, exposing the pathetic, desperate fraud hiding underneath. Jasmine, however, did not care about the facts. The realization that she was not going to get her dream house shattered her golden child composure. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. She threw her iced coffee into the trash can, splattering brown liquid against the wall. "You are such a bitter, selfish witch!" Maya Jasmine shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the small space. "You always do this. You have always been jealous of me, and you spend your entire miserable life trying to ruin mine." I stared at her, genuinely marveling at her ability to make herself the victim in a situation where she had just tried to rob me blind. "You purposely bought that specific house just to humiliate Preston," Jasmine screamed, stomping her foot like a spoiled toddler. "Just like you purposely scheduled your stupid Tech Innovator Award ceremony on the exact same day I got my nursing exam results back. You knew I failed those boards, Maya. You knew I was heartbroken, but you just had to post all those pictures of yourself holding a trophy just to rub it in my face and make mom and dad look at you instead of comforting me. You steal every good thing that is supposed to be mine. Her unhinged logic was a perfect reflection of my entire childhood. In Jasmine's warped reality, carefully constructed and protected by my mother and father, my independent success was never the result of my own grueling hard work. My success was simply an act of malicious aggression against her. If I won, it meant I was deliberately trying to make her lose. It was the exact same toxic rhetoric Calvin had used when he locked me out in the snow at 18 years old. I am done listening to this absolute garbage, I said, pointing a firm finger toward the hallway. Get out of my apartment, both of you, right now. Jasmine let out a theatrical, piercing sob, covering her face with her hands as she pushed past me, running out into the hallway to play the tragic wounded victim for an audience of none. Preston lingered behind his face, burning with a toxic mix of intense humiliation and desperate fury. He walked toward the exit, but just as I grabbed the handle to slam the heavy wooden door behind him, Preston quickly spun around and wedged his expensive leather shoe into the doorframe. He caught the heavy wood with his hand, stopping it from closing. The slick, condescending salesman routine was completely gone. His eyes were dark, resentful, and filled with a dangerous, calculating malice. He leaned in close to my face, his breath smelling of stale mints and bitter defeat. "You are making a huge mistake, Maya," Preston whispered, his voice dropping into a flat, lethal threat that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "You think your money makes you untouchable, but you do not know how this game is actually played in the real world. Family takes care of family whether they want to or not." The official summons arrived exactly 2 days after Preston wedged his designer shoe into my doorway and delivered his pathetic threat. It was not a phone call or a text message. My father did not communicate like a normal parent. He operated like a mafia boss running a religious syndicate. He sent his head deacon directly to my corporate office building to hand-deliver a sealed, embossed envelope containing a mandatory invitation to his pastoral suite. The Sanctuary of Grace was not just a church. It was a sprawling, multi-million-dollar campus in the heart of Atlanta that looked more like a corporate fortress than a place of worship. As I drove through the wrought iron security gates that Thursday afternoon, I took in the manicured lawns, the massive glass sanctuary that seated 10,000 people, and the fleet of luxury vehicles parked in the executive lot. Calvin had built a kingdom on the tithes of working-class people, convincing them that his absolute luxury was a sign of divine favor. I parked my unassuming sedan between a Bentley and a Porsche and made my way into the executive administrative wing. The air conditioning was freezing, carrying the scent of expensive floor polish and fresh lilies. 2 secretaries sitting behind a curved mahogany reception desk immediately stopped typing when I walked in. They gave me tight, practiced smiles, completely unaware that the pastor's estranged daughter was about to walk into a war zone. They buzzed me through the heavy double doors without a single word. Calvin's office was explicitly designed to make you feel small. That was the entire point of the architecture. The ceilings were impossibly high. The walls were lined with leather-bound volumes he never read and framed photographs of himself shaking hands with mayors, governors, and celebrities. His desk was a massive slab of dark walnut, positioned strategically in front of a floor-to-ceiling window, so that anyone sitting across from him would be blinded by the afternoon sun. He was sitting behind that desk when I walked in wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit, his hands steeped under his chin. He did not stand up to greet me. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not offer me a drink. He simply gestured to the low, uncomfortable chair opposite him. "Have a seat, Maya," he commanded. His voice was a rich, smooth baritone, the exact same voice he used to command 10,000 people to empty their wallets every Sunday morning. I remained standing. I had spent my entire childhood shrinking under the weight of his authority, apologizing for taking up space and begging for a fraction of the approval he showered on Jasmine. But the woman standing in his office today was not that frightened teenager. I walked over to the chair, placed my hands on the leather backrest, and looked down at him. "I do not have time for a sermon, Dad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. You sent your attack dog to my office. What do you want? Calvin let out a slow, patronizing sigh, shaking his head as if dealing with a rebellious toddler. He opened the top drawer of his desk, pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, and pushed them across the polished walnut surface toward me. I want to protect you from yourself, he said smoothly. Preston came to me highly distressed about this stunt you pulled with the Wellington estate. Buying a $4 million historic property is not a game, Maya. The property taxes the maintenance, the liability. It is entirely too much for a single woman with no husband and no financial advisors to handle. You are playing a dangerous game with money you clearly do not understand. I glanced down at those documents. The bold print at the top of the page jumped out at me immediately. It was a quitclaim deed. Attached to it was a transfer of ownership agreement. I understand money perfectly well, I replied. My eyes locked on the paperwork. I understand it well enough to buy a house in cash while your son-in-law is drowning in debt. What exactly is this, Calvin? It is a solution, he stated, leaning back in his expensive leather chair. I have instructed my legal team to establish a family trust. You are going to sign that property over to the trust today. Preston will manage the estate, handle the upkeep, and utilize the space for his corporate clients, so the property actually generates revenue. In exchange, the trust will provide you with a modest monthly stipend, and we will allow you to live in the guest house. It is the most responsible way to handle this situation. We are stepping in to save you from bankruptcy. I stared at him, genuinely stunned by the sheer, unadulterated narcissism of his demand. He was not asking for a favor. He was not negotiating. He was actively ordering me to sign away my $4 million home, the physical proof of my success, so he could hand it over to his failing son-in-law. He wanted to strip me of my wealth and put me on an allowance, forcing me to live in my own backyard while Jasmine paraded through my halls. You want me to sign my house over to you? I said, the words tasting completely absurd as they left my mouth. You summoned me here to rob me. Do not use that kind of ugly language in my office. Calvin snapped his pastoral mask, slipping just a fraction. This is about family legacy, Maya. This is about order. Scripture tells us to honor our father and mother. You have been running wild for too long, completely disconnected from the family that raised you. You owe us for the life you have. You owe this family for the foundation we gave you. The audacity of the word owe struck a nerve so deep it sent a jolt of pure fire straight through my veins. I leaned forward, placing both of my hands flat on his desk, bringing my face inches from his. I owe you absolutely nothing, I said, my voice dropping into a deadly whisper. Let us talk about the foundation you gave me. 15 years ago, you threw me out of your house, in the middle of a snowstorm, because I refused to drain my college savings to buy lip gloss for Jasmine. You left me to sleep in a freezing car. You did not pay for a single credit of my tuition. You did not pay for my food, my rent, or my clothes. You have not bought me a Christmas gift, sent a birthday card, or contributed a single dime to my existence in a decade and a half. Calvin's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as I systematically dismantled his delusion. The only thing you ever gave me was the realization that I had to build an empire to protect myself from my own father. I continued, my voice gaining strength and volume. I built a multi-million-dollar technology firm while you were busy buying Preston a fake career. I bought the Wellington estate with my own money. You did not build me, Dad. I built myself despite you. I am not signing anything, and if Preston or Jasmine ever step foot on my property again, I will have them arrested for trespassing. For a long, terrible moment, the grand office was completely silent. The hum of the air conditioning seemed to vanish. Calvin stared at me, and I watched the benevolent, loving pastor completely disappear. The man who preached forgiveness and grace to thousands every Sunday was gone. In his place sat a ruthless, calculating predator who was not used to being told no. His hands slowly unclasped. He placed them flat on the desk, mirroring my posture, and leaned forward. The temperature in the room plummeted. You think you are so smart, Maya, Calvin said. His voice stripped of all its warmth, replaced by a cold, metallic, lethal edge. You think your little computer business makes you powerful? But you are nothing in this city. I am the one with the mayor on speed dial. I am the one with the best attorneys in the state sitting in my congregation. I built you, Maya, whether you want to admit it or not. I gave you the drive to prove me wrong, and I can take it all away. He slowly slid the unsigned quitclaim deed back across the desk, placing it directly in front of himself. He tapped his index finger against the paper, his eyes boring into mine with absolute chilling certainty. I am not asking for your permission anymore, he whispered, his face devoid of any paternal affection. I am giving you a promise. By this time next week, that house will be mine. I will tear down everything you have built. I will freeze every account you own, and I will take that property from you, even if I have to do it while you are wearing handcuffs. Exactly a week before Christmas, the illusion of safety shattered completely. I was sitting in my corner office overlooking the Atlanta skyline, reviewing a final quarter security patch for a federal client when my assistant buzzed me. A courier was waiting in the lobby, and he aggressively refused to leave the package with the front desk. I walked out to the glass-walled reception area of my cybersecurity firm, listening to the quiet hum of my employees working at their stations. A man in a cheap suit handed me a thick manila envelope, snapped a quick photograph of me holding it with his phone, and walked onto the elevator without a single word. I carried the heavy packet back to my desk and tore the top seal. Inside was a stack of legal documents stamped by the Fulton County Superior Court. The bold black letters at the top of the first page made the breath catch in my throat. Emergency injunction. Order of asset seizure. Notice of eviction. I skimmed the pages, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon with growing horror. The plaintiffs listed on the lawsuit were the Sanctuary of Grace Ministries and a commercial holding company I immediately recognized as one of Preston's shell corporations. The allegations were breathtaking in their sheer audacity. Calvin and Preston had filed a sworn affidavit claiming I had embezzled millions of dollars from the church's tax-exempt building fund. They had completely fabricated a paper trail suggesting I had set up dummy vendor contracts through my tech firm, funneling the congregation's hard-earned tithes directly into my personal accounts to purchase the Buckhead Manor. They were officially framing me for grand larceny, corporate embezzlement, and wire fraud. If a judge believed even a fraction of this preliminary filing, I was looking at federal prison time. Preston had clearly used his shady real estate connections to forge a phantom financial history, backdating invoices and altering routing numbers to make it look like the massive cash payment I made for my home originated from Calvin's collection plates. It was a flawless, lethal frame job utilizing the untouchable shield of a megachurch. My office phone remained silent, but my personal cell phone lit up on my desk. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. I stared at the screen as it rang, letting it go straight to voicemail. A minute later, a new audio message appeared. I tapped play and turned the volume up, leaning back in my chair. Valerie did not sound panicked. She sounded profoundly annoyed, speaking in a hushed, rushed whisper, as if she was hiding in her expansive walk-in closet. Maya, I know you received the papers by now. She began, her tone dripping with condescension. Do not make this harder than it has to be. Your father is furious, and you know what happens when he feels disrespected. He will ruin you to protect this ministry. Just sign the house over to the family trust today, and he will call off the lawyers. Do not be selfish, Maya. You know his reputation is the only thing keeping this family at the top of the social ladder. Just take the fall and walk away quietly. It is exactly like the time Jasmine totaled his luxury sedan when you were teenagers, and you took the blame so the press would not find out she was driving under the influence. Or when you moved out quietly so nobody would ask why he refused to pay your college tuition. You have always been strong enough to handle the hit. Jasmine cannot handle this kind of disappointment. Your father cannot be questioned. Just sign the deed, Maya. We will send you a nice gift card for Christmas to help you get a new apartment. The recording clicked off. The absolute cruelty of her words hung heavily in the sterile air of my office. Valerie had spent my entire life offering me up as a human shield to protect Calvin's immaculate public image and Jasmine's fragile, spoiled ego. I was not a daughter to her. I was a utility. I was collateral damage. She genuinely expected me to sign away a $4 million home and accept the lifelong label of a corporate thief just to keep the peace and ensure Jasmine got the luxury lifestyle she felt entitled to. I threw my phone onto the desk and looked back at the legal injunction. The true brilliance of Calvin's attack began to crystallize in my mind. He did not actually have the evidence to put me in prison because the evidence did not exist. The entire lawsuit was a mirage designed to trigger an automatic legal mechanism. In civil litigation involving severe corporate fraud and grand larceny, the standard procedure is to place an immediate freeze on all assets belonging to the accused until the trial concludes. Calvin knew exactly what an asset freeze would do to me and my life's work. My cybersecurity firm operated on highly sensitive government and financial sector contracts. Our service-level agreements contained strict morality and financial solvency clauses. If word leaked to the press that the CEO was under investigation for embezzling millions from a church, or if my corporate accounts were frozen by a judge, I would be in immediate breach of contract. My clients would pull their business overnight to protect their own security. I would not be able to make payroll for my team. My $80 million company would bleed out and die in less than a month. I could hire the most aggressive defense attorney in Atlanta. I could fight the forged documents in a court of law. I could spend a year painstakingly proving my innocence through forensic accounting and digital audits. But it would not matter at all. By the time the judge banged the gavel and cleared my name, I would be entirely bankrupt. My company would be dust. My employees would be jobless. The Buckhead Manor would be foreclosed on due to frozen funds and scooped up by Preston for pennies on the dollar. They had engineered a scenario where fighting by the rules guaranteed my absolute destruction. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the crawling traffic of the city below. The panic that had briefly gripped my chest evaporated entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating calm that settled deep in my bones. Calvin and Preston thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They thought they were dealing with a naive, frightened daughter who would scramble to find a lawyer and beg for mercy on her knees. They completely forgot who they were dealing with. They forgot that they had pushed me out into the freezing snow at 18, forcing me to learn how to dismantle complex systems and build impenetrable firewalls just to survive. I did not get to the top of the tech industry by playing fair against men who wanted to crush me. I got here by seeing the flaws in their architecture and exploiting them without hesitation. If I fought this in traditional civil court, I would lose everything I had built. The justice system was entirely too slow, and Calvin's pockets were entirely too deep. I realized in that quiet moment, looking out over the city, that hiring a lawyer was the worst possible thing I could do. I could not fight fair against people who forged deeds and stole from their own congregation. I had to play their game. I just had to play it 10 times dirtier. I turned away from the window and walked toward the secure server room at the back of my office. I was not going to litigate this in a courtroom. I was going to hack them to the bone. I locked the heavy steel door of my server room, plunging myself into the chilled, soundproofed sanctuary that housed the brain of my company. The air in here was strictly temperature-controlled, smelling of ozone and actively cooled silicon. The low, steady hum of the massive server racks was the only sound. This was my domain. Calvin operated in a world of stained glass, booming microphones, and blind faith. I operated in a world of absolute verifiable data. He believed his power came from a divine mandate that made him untouchable. I was about to show him that on the internet there are no gods, only administrators. I did not sit down at my regular desk. I moved to an isolated terminal in the corner of the room, booting up a secure air-gapped machine running a custom operating system I had built entirely from scratch. I cracked my knuckles, staring at the blank black screen as lines of green text began to cascade downward. I was not going to hire a lawyer to play defense in a rigged civil court. I was going to rip the Sanctuary of Grace Ministries apart from the inside out. My first target was the emergency injunction itself. I uploaded the digital file of the court documents the courier had delivered. Calvin and Preston had filed the paperwork electronically to expedite the asset freeze, which was their first massive mistake. They assumed a PDF was just a flat image. To me, a PDF was a treasure map. I ran the file through a metadata extraction script. In less than 10 seconds, the hidden architecture of the document was exposed on my monitor. I could see exactly when the file was created, when it was modified, and the exact IP address of the machine that generated it. The legal petition itself originated from a high-end law firm in downtown Atlanta. The legal team Calvin kept on a massive retainer. But the financial exhibits attached to the lawsuit, the allegedly damning invoices proving I had funneled church funds into my own accounts, were entirely different. Those pages had been spliced into the document later. I traced the IP address of the machine that generated those specific financial exhibits. It did not route back to the law firm, and it did not route back to the church administrative offices. It routed directly to a private, unsecured wireless network registered to Preston's commercial real estate firm. Preston had personally forged the financial documents on his office computer. He had fabricated invoices to make it look like my cybersecurity firm was billing the church for phantom IT services, then manually altered the routing numbers to point to the Wellington Estates escrow account. It was a sloppy, desperate frame job by a man who barely understood how to convert a Word document, let alone how to cover his digital tracks. But a forged document was not enough to guarantee my safety. If I took this metadata to a judge, Calvin's lawyers would simply claim Preston was acting as a concerned family member gathering financial evidence. I needed to prove why they were framing me. I needed to find the real missing money. Breaching the Sanctuary of Grace network was almost insultingly easy. Calvin spent millions on high-definition broadcasting cameras and theatrical lighting for his Sunday services, but he treated his cybersecurity like an unnecessary expense. The church used a third-party vendor for their online tithing and credit card processing, but their internal administrative portal, the system that housed their private ledgers, payroll, and executive communications, was running on outdated software with known, unpatched vulnerabilities. I routed my connection through a series of encrypted proxy servers across 3 different continents, masking my digital fingerprint so thoroughly that even if Calvin hired a forensic specialist, they would think the hack originated from a server farm in Eastern Europe. I targeted the church's chief financial officer. I bypassed his laughably weak password, an unholy combination of his wife's name and the year his favorite sports team won a championship, and bypassed the two-factor authentication by intercepting the SMS token through a vulnerability in the local cellular carrier network. I was in. I had complete unfettered access to the financial heart of Calvin's empire. I immediately navigated to the church's building fund. According to the lawsuit they had filed against me, this was the specific account I had allegedly drained to buy my $4 million mansion. I pulled up the transaction history for the past 36 months. The ledger populated on my screen in rows of stark white numbers. What I saw made my blood run instantly cold. The building fund was not missing $4 million. It was missing closer to $12 million. And the money had not been stolen in one massive lump sum transfer to buy a house in Buckhead. It had been systematically bled dry in hundreds of smaller weekly installments over the course of 3 years. I highlighted the outgoing transfers and traced the destination accounts. The money was not going to fake IT vendors. It was flowing out of the tax-exempt church accounts and directly into 3 different limited liability companies. I opened a secondary terminal and ran those LLCs through the state corporate registry. The registered agent for all 3 companies was a corporate proxy service designed to hide the true owners, but they could not hide the tax identification numbers. I ran a cross-reference algorithm matching the tax IDs against state real estate holdings. All 3 shell companies were listed as the primary financial backers for a series of catastrophic commercial real estate failures across the state. a half-built shopping plaza in the suburbs that had stalled due to bankruptcy, a massive warehouse district that had been condemned due to structural negligence, an office park that was currently facing foreclosure. I pulled the ownership deeds for those failed properties. Every single one of them belonged to Preston. The scope of the crime finally crystallized in my mind, brilliant and horrifying. Preston was not just a failing real estate agent. He was a black hole of debt, losing millions of dollars on terrible commercial investments. To save him from complete financial ruin and protect Jasmine's lavish lifestyle, Calvin had been secretly keeping Preston afloat using the church's tax-exempt donations. Calvin had been siphoning tithes from his own devoted congregation, laundering the money through shell LLCs, and using it to cover Preston's margin calls and massive commercial loan defaults. But a financial hemorrhage of that magnitude could not stay hidden forever. The church's independent board of directors was scheduled to demand a full audit of the building fund before the end of the year. Calvin and Preston were completely out of time. They needed a massive influx of cash to replace the stolen funds, or they needed a scapegoat to take the blame for the missing millions. When Preston looked over my shoulder in my apartment and saw the deed to the Wellington estate, they realized they had found both. They could frame the estranged tech-savvy daughter for the embezzlement using my sudden, unexplained wealth as the perfect motive. They would freeze my assets, force me into a corner, and legally seize my $4 million home to liquidate it and cover their own tracks before the board of directors initiated the audit. My mother's voicemail suddenly made perfect, sickening sense. Valerie was not just trying to protect Calvin's social reputation. She was actively trying to help him cover up a massive federal crime. I had the mechanics of the fraud, but I needed the intent. I needed undeniable proof that Calvin and Preston had orchestrated this together. I needed their own words. I left the financial ledgers and pivoted my attack to the church's internal communication servers. I located Calvin's private encrypted email archive. This required more finesse. I unleashed a specialized decryption tool, letting it chew through the encryption keys while I monitored the network traffic to ensure I remained undetected. It took exactly 14 minutes for the encryption to shatter. I dumped Calvin's entire inbox into a searchable database and ran a query for Preston's email address, filtering the results by the highest priority flags sent within the last 60 days. A single email thread popped up at the very top of the list. The subject line was blank. It had been sent 3 weeks ago, long before Thanksgiving. I opened the message. It was an email from Preston to Calvin, and it was the digital equivalent of a man begging for his life on his knees. "Calvin," the email read, the text rushed and completely stripped of Preston's usual arrogance. "The bank is calling the loan on the retail park tomorrow morning. If I do not have $700,000 wired into the holding account by Friday, they are seizing the property and initiating personal bankruptcy proceedings against me. Jasmine cannot know about this. She is already stressed about the apartment size. You have to authorize another transfer from the sanctuary fund. Please, this is the last time, I swear." I scrolled down to read Calvin's reply, sent just 2 hours later from his private pastoral account. "The building fund is bled dry, Preston." Calvin had written, his tone cold and exhausted. "The board is asking questions about the delays in the community center construction. I cannot authorize another blind transfer without triggering an automatic internal audit. I have protected you as long as I can to keep my daughter happy, but we are entirely out of capital. We need a permanent solution to this deficit, not another temporary patch. Fix your own mess, or I will let the bank bury you." I sat back in my chair, the glow of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. This was it. This was the exact moment their desperation peaked. Just weeks before Thanksgiving, they were staring down the barrel of total financial and criminal exposure. I was the permanent solution they were looking for. I initiated a mass download protocol. I pulled every single altered invoice, every laundered bank transfer, the complete shell company registration history, and the entire damning email thread between the pastor and his son-in-law. I watched the progress bar race across the screen, securing gigabytes of classified, highly illegal data into a heavily encrypted external drive. I watched the final file transfer complete with a satisfying chime. I pulled the encrypted drive from the port and held it in the palm of my hand. The weight of it was incredibly light, but it contained enough explosive material to level Calvin's megachurch to the foundation and send both him and Preston to a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. I had the absolute truth. I had the undeniable proof of their crimes. I had the bullet. But if I just handed this over to a judge, Calvin's high-priced lawyers would tie the evidence up in endless litigation, while my company bled to death under the asset freeze. I could not just fire this randomly. I had to ensure the impact was public, catastrophic, and completely inescapable. I needed a way to deliver this payload so perfectly that Calvin's empire would crumble before his lawyers even had time to draft a response. She now has the bullet, but she needs the gun. I did not leave my apartment for the rest of the weekend. I stayed locked inside, surviving on black coffee and adrenaline, mapping out the architecture of my father's fraudulent empire on a whiteboard. By Sunday morning, I had every shell company, every offshore transfer, and every forged invoice perfectly documented and linked. But having the data was only half the battle. I needed to understand his strategy. At exactly 10 o'clock, I opened my laptop and navigated to the Sanctuary of Grace live stream. The camera panned across the massive 10,000-seat auditorium, capturing a sea of devoted parishioners. The lighting was dramatic, the choir was humming a soft, mournful hymn, and Calvin stood behind his transparent acrylic podium. He was not wearing his usual vibrant, triumphant suit. He wore a subdued, dark gray jacket. He looked appropriately devastated, playing the role of the wounded shepherd to absolute perfection. He gripped the edges of the podium, bowing his head as if the weight of the world was pressing down on his shoulders. When he finally looked up, his eyes were shining with unshed, perfectly manufactured tears. "Brothers and sisters," Calvin began, his rich baritone voice echoing through the massive sanctuary and out to the thousands watching online. "I come to you today not just as your pastor, but as a broken, grieving father. We talk often about the attacks of the enemy from the outside world. We prepare ourselves for the storms that hit our community. But the most devastating betrayal is the one that comes from within your own home, the one that sits at your dinner table." A collective murmur of sympathy rolled through the congregation. I watched, my jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached as my father weaponized the very people he was actively robbing. "We have suffered a grave theft in this house of worship," Calvin continued, his voice trembling with righteous sorrow. "Funds that were meant for our new community center, funds that you sacrificed to give, have been taken. And it breaks my heart to stand before you and confess that the thief is my own flesh and blood. A daughter who has lost her way. A daughter who allowed the greed of the secular world to poison her soul." He did not say my name, but he did not have to. The Sanctuary of Grace was a tight-knit community, and the rumors had already been planted by his deacons. He spent the next 45 minutes twisting scripture, preaching about wayward children and the agonizing duty of a father to cast out the wicked to protect the flock. He positioned my alleged crime not just as a financial theft, but as a spiritual assault on the entire African American community that had built the church from the ground up. He painted me as a greedy corporate sellout who had drained the lifeblood of a Black-owned institution to fund my own lavish secular lifestyle. The fallout was instantaneous. Before the live stream even concluded, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently against the kitchen table. The screen lit up with names of extended family members I had not spoken to in years. Aunts, uncles, and second cousins who had never bothered to ask how I was doing were suddenly mobilized into an army of righteous indignation. I watched the missed calls pile up, followed immediately by a flood of vitriolic voicemails and text messages. I clicked on a voice message from my Aunt Beatrice, my mother's older sister. Her voice was shrill and vibrating with absolute disgust. "How could you do this?" Maya Beatrice demanded through the phone speaker. "Your father built that ministry to uplift our people, and you steal from the collection plate to buy yourself a mansion. You are a total disgrace to this family. You are a disgrace to Black women everywhere. We always knew you were jealous of Jasmine, but to rob the sanctuary just to prove a point. You make me absolutely sick. Do not ever show your face in this family again." The gaslighting was masterful. Calvin had successfully isolated me, turning my own extended family into a firing squad. But the assault was not just limited to the older generation. Jasmine was simultaneously executing her own highly coordinated strike on a completely different battlefield. I opened social media, and Jasmine's face instantly filled my screen. She had posted a new video to her 2 million followers. She was sitting on the floor of her luxury penthouse, wearing a beige, oversized cashmere sweater, looking strategically disheveled. The glamorous makeup was gone, replaced by bare skin and red-rimmed eyes. She stared directly into the camera, wiping away a single perfect tear. "Hey guys," Jasmine said, her voice shaking with practiced vulnerability. "I have always been super authentic with you all, and right now, my family is going through an absolute nightmare. I never thought I would be homeless for the holidays." I stared at the screen in pure disbelief. She was sitting in a $10,000 a month penthouse, complaining about being homeless. Preston and I put our entire life savings into securing our dream home, an estate we were going to use to start a family foundation. Jasmine continued sniffing delicately. But the funds were stolen. They were intercepted by someone I trusted my entire life, my own sister. She embezzled the money from my father's church to buy the house out from under us. I am just so heartbroken. It is terrifying when you realize that the most toxic, narcissistic people in your life are the ones sharing your DNA. Please just pray for us. The comments beneath the video were a bloodbath. Thousands of strangers were tagging my name, linking my company website, and calling for my immediate arrest. Jasmine had perfectly manipulated the algorithm, weaponizing therapy speak and victimhood to unleash a digital mob on my life. By Monday morning, the personal attacks officially breached the walls of my professional sanctuary. I arrived at my office at 6 in the morning, hoping to finalize my counteroffensive, but the damage was already accelerating at a terrifying pace. At 8:15, my secure direct line rang. It was the chief information officer of a major aerospace defense contractor, one of my firm's most lucrative accounts. "Maya, we have a massive problem," he said, skipping the usual pleasantries. His tone was cold and strictly corporate. "My board is seeing some highly disturbing rumors online regarding an embezzlement investigation in Fulton County involving you and a megachurch. The allegations are completely fabricated." I responded smoothly, keeping my voice steady. "It is a retaliatory civil dispute initiated by estranged family members. My legal team is handling it, and it has absolutely zero bearing on my firm's operational integrity." "I appreciate that, Maya, but our contracts require absolute reputational solvency," he replied, his voice unyielding. "We cannot have our cybersecurity infrastructure managed by a CEO currently facing public accusations of grand larceny and wire fraud. We are pausing our contract renewal indefinitely until your name is fully cleared." Before I could even attempt to salvage the account, he hung up. Over the next 3 hours, my office turned into a triage center. My lead project manager knocked on my door, his face pale and slick with sweat. 3 more financial sector clients had called to suspend their accounts. The rumor mill was moving faster than a virus. In the corporate world of elite cybersecurity, trust is the only currency that matters. When clients believe you are capable of stealing millions from a church, they do not trust you with their classified data. Calvin and Jasmine's highly coordinated smear campaign was actively bleeding my company dry. I sat at my massive desk, the encrypted hard drive sitting right in front of me. The full crushing weight of Calvin's strategy finally settled over me. He had trapped me in an invisible cage. He had the pulpit, he had the congregation, and he had the entire community convinced he was a tragic hero. Jasmine had the viral sympathy of millions of strangers. They had a massive coordinated megaphone, and they were using it to scream a lie so loudly that it became the truth. If I quietly handed this encrypted drive over to the police, the investigation would take months. During those months, the rumors would persist, the clients would flee, and my $80 million firm would collapse into dust. I could not survive a quiet legal battle. The truth does not matter if nobody is willing to listen to you. I looked down at the encrypted drive, a slow, dangerous smile finally breaking across my face. Calvin was right about one thing. A microphone is a weapon. I just needed to steal his. I did not need a lawyer, and I did not need a detective. I needed an audience. I checked the calendar on my desk. The Sanctuary of Grace's annual Christmas Eve televised midnight service was exactly 3 days away. It was Calvin's biggest event of the year, broadcast live to thousands in the building and hundreds of thousands watching on the global television network. He wanted to play the victim on a massive stage. I was going to give him the performance of a lifetime. I reached for my keyboard and began writing the code that would completely hijack the church's broadcasting network. By Christmas Eve, the entire world was going to see exactly who my father really was. The silence in my office was deafening, broken only by the incessant muffled buzzing of my desk phone. Another client calling to sever ties. Another corporate partner backing away from the radioactive fallout of Calvin's Sunday sermon. I ignored the flashing red light on the console and turned my attention back to the encrypted drive resting on my desk. I had the evidence to destroy them, but raw data was useless if Calvin saw the strike coming. He had the money and the influence to sever the church's broadcasting network the second he suspected a breach. If I was going to hijack his Christmas Eve midnight service and broadcast his financial crimes to millions of people, I needed him completely relaxed. I needed him standing at that acrylic podium, feeling absolutely invincible. I needed Preston measuring the square footage of my living room in his head. I needed Jasmine picking out new curtains for my master bedroom. The only way to execute a flawless ambush is to convince your enemy that the war is already over. I picked up my personal cell phone. The screen was still littered with vile notifications from extended family members, hate mail from church parishioners, and links to Jasmine's tear-stained, passive-aggressive social media posts. I swiped away the vitriol and opened the family group chat. The last message sent in this thread was from nearly a year ago, a generic holiday greeting from my mother that I had ignored. Now it was going to be the stage for my tactical surrender. I sat back in my chair, staring at the blank text box. I had to channel the 18-year-old girl they had thrown out into the snow. I had to summon the frightened, overwhelmed daughter who used to take the blame for Jasmine's drunk driving incidents just to keep the peace. I needed to feed them exactly what they craved: absolute humiliating defeat. They did not just want my house, they wanted me broken. I began to type deliberately, choosing words that reeked of desperation and panic. I let my fingers hover over the digital keyboard, perfectly calibrating the tone of a woman who had just watched her life's work evaporate. "I cannot do this anymore," I typed, ensuring I used no punctuation to simulate a frantic state of mind. "The clients are leaving. The business is dying. I cannot fight you and Preston's lawyers. I do not have the money for a drawn-out civil case, and I do not want to go to federal prison for something I did not do." I paused, reading the words back. It was good, but it needed to stroke Calvin's God complex. It needed to show that his sermon had hit its mark, that his public shaming had successfully crushed my spirit. "You win, Dad," I continued. "You completely ruined me. I surrender the property. I will sign whatever documents Preston's lawyers need me to sign to lift the asset freeze and stop the criminal investigation. I am moving my personal belongings out over the next 2 days. I am leaving the keys under the mat on Christmas Eve. Enjoy the house, Jasmine." I stared at the block of text. It was a masterpiece of submission. It validated every arrogant assumption they held about my resilience. I took a steadying breath, pressed send, and dropped the phone onto the smooth glass surface of my desk. Now the psychological warfare truly began. I watched the screen intently. Within seconds, the tiny text indicating that the message had been read by multiple people appeared beneath my desperate plea. They were all active. They were probably sitting in Calvin's sprawling living room right now, sipping expensive wine paid for by the church's building fund, watching my professional execution on the evening news. The 3 gray dots appeared on the screen. Someone was typing. The dots vanished, then reappeared. They were coordinating their response, basking in the glow of their unholy victory. A full 5 minutes passed. They were letting me sweat. They wanted me sitting in my empty office, agonizing over their silence, feeling the full weight of my supposed homelessness. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hands, my eyes locked on the glowing rectangle of glass. Finally, a notification pinged. It was from Jasmine. I swiped open the message. There were no words, no fake sympathy, no acknowledgement of the life she had just stolen from me. It was just a single digital image, a emoji. It was a breathtaking display of callousness. It was Jasmine telling me that my complete financial ruin, the loss of my home, and the destruction of my reputation meant absolutely nothing to her. She was filing her nails while I bled out. She was dismissing my entire existence with a tiny, colorful cartoon. It was exactly the kind of vapid, cruel victory lap I had anticipated. She was already mentally moving her designer clothes into my walk-in closet. 10 seconds later, a second message arrived. This one was from Valerie. I tapped the screen, bracing myself for my mother's specific brand of toxic maternal condescension. Valerie never missed an opportunity to kick me while I was down under the guise of offering practical advice. "We will send you a gift card for Christmas." Valerie wrote, her words dripping with fake sympathy and absolute apathy. "Try to find a nice apartment. Your father is willing to call off the lawyers once the deed is officially transferred to Preston's holding company. Do not contact the church administration again. We need to heal as a family now." I read the message 3 times, letting the sheer audacity of her words wash over me. She was offering me a generic retail gift card in exchange for a $4 million estate. She was telling me to find a nice apartment after actively participating in a plot to render me homeless and frame me for a federal crime. And the final sickening twist, demanding that the family needed to heal now that they had successfully extracted everything of value from my life. The screen went dark. No message from Calvin, no message from Preston. The men who had orchestrated the financial slaughter felt no need to dirty their hands with a response. They let the women deliver the final blows, satisfied in their quiet, arrogant triumph. They truly believed I was packing cardboard boxes in the dark, preparing to vanish into obscurity. They thought I was destroyed. They thought the board of directors would never see the missing $12 million because they had successfully secured my assets to cover the deficit. They thought Christmas Eve was going to be a celebration of their divine untouchability. I sat back in my leather ergonomic chair and picked up the phone one last time. I looked at the nail polish emoji. I looked at the promise of a holiday gift card. The terrified, panicked expression I had been wearing, the slumped shoulders, the shallow breathing, it all evaporated in a fraction of a second. The mask fell away, revealing the cold, hardened focus of a woman who had just successfully lured her predators onto a minefield. My tears dried instantly. The heavy, suffocating anxiety vanished, replaced by a surge of pure, icy adrenaline. They had taken the bait perfectly. They had consumed the lie without chewing, blinded by their own narcissism and greed. They were lowering their shields, celebrating a victory that was going to cost them their freedom. I locked my phone, tossing it casually across the smooth surface of my desk. I turned my attention back to the massive curved monitors dominating my workstation. "Hook, line, and sinker," I whispered to the empty room. I pulled my keyboard forward, my fingers hovering over the keys. The tactical surrender was complete. The enemy was completely disarmed. Now I had exactly 72 hours to rig the explosive. I opened a secure command terminal, bringing up the architectural schematics of the Sanctuary of Grace's broadcasting network. Calvin's audio-visual team utilized a state-of-the-art cloud-based distribution platform to simultaneously broadcast his sermons to the local screens inside the megachurch, their official website, and 3 different satellite television networks. It was a highly sophisticated setup designed to reach a global audience. It was also highly susceptible to a targeted routing hijack if you held the administrative credentials. I did not just have the credentials, I had the entire master key. I began coding a phantom override sequence. On Christmas Eve at exactly midnight, Calvin would step up to his acrylic podium. He would look out at the thousands of parishioners holding lit candles. He would smile his $1 million smile and begin his sermon on redemption and sacrifice. The church's media team would push the button to send his live video feed to the world. But my code was going to intercept that signal in the dark space between the church servers and the global network. I was going to construct a digital dam. When the media director pushed the broadcast button, Calvin's face would vanish. Instead, the screens inside the sanctuary, the homepage of their website, and the satellite television feed would all simultaneously broadcast a highly curated, fully automated presentation. I opened the encrypted drive containing the stolen metadata, the laundered LLC bank transfers, and the panicked email thread between Calvin and Preston. I started formatting the raw data into stark, aggressive visual graphics. I built slides showing the exact dollar amounts draining from the church building fund. I highlighted the routing numbers pointing directly to Preston's failing commercial real estate projects. I created a massive, unignorable graphic of the email where Calvin explicitly admitted the church accounts were bled dry to protect Jasmine's lifestyle. I was going to project their federal crimes onto massive 50-foot LED screens in the middle of a packed midnight service. I was going to force the entire congregation, the board of directors, and the federal authorities watching at home to read the exact emails where their pastor admitted to stealing their money. I linked the automated presentation to a dead man's switch. Once the broadcast hijack initiated, it would lock out the church's local control panels. The media team would not be able to cut the video feed. They would not be able to turn off the projectors. They would be completely paralyzed, forced to watch alongside the congregation as the financial autopsy of the Sanctuary of Grace was laid bare for the world to see. My phone buzzed again across the desk. Another angry voicemail from a distant cousin. I smiled, the glow of the green code reflecting in my eyes. They could call me a thief today. They could drag my name through the mud and celebrate my destruction all week long. Let them gloat. Let them measure for curtains. Let them believe they had won. I hit execute on the primary routing script, embedding the phantom override deep within the church's network architecture. The trap was officially set, invisible, and waiting. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the quiet hum of my servers, completely at peace. I was not going to run. I was not going to hide. I was going to show up to the Christmas Eve service, and I was going to watch my father's empire burn to the ground from the front row. The phantom override was securely embedded in the Sanctuary of Grace, broadcasting network sitting dormant like a digital landmine waiting for Calvin to step on it. But destroying his public image on a global broadcast was only half of my agenda. Jasmine and Preston wanted my physical home. They wanted the tangible proof of my success to cover their own massive financial failures. I was more than happy to hand it over to them, provided they paid the ultimate price for admission. I left the sterile chill of my corporate server room, locked the heavy steel doors behind me, and drove through the dark, freezing streets toward Buckhead. My $4 million estate sat perfectly silent at the end of the long, manicured driveway. It looked like a prize to be won. It was about to become an inescapable prison. I pulled my SUV into the expansive garage and popped the trunk. Inside were 4 heavy-duty tactical crates packed with top-tier military-grade surveillance equipment. I had spent the last decade securing digital perimeters for federal contractors, building impenetrable firewalls to keep threats out. For the next 3 days, my goal was the exact opposite. I was building a physical trap designed to pull the threat inside, make them incredibly comfortable, and then lock the doors permanently behind them. I hauled the first crate into the grand foyer. The space was cavernous, featuring a sweeping double staircase and a massive crystal chandelier hanging 20 feet above the imported marble floor. I set up a specialized fiberglass ladder and climbed toward the glittering canopy. Rigging the optics, I pulled a micro 4K optical lens from my tool belt. It was smaller than a dime, utilized by high-level intelligence operatives for covert observation. I carefully unscrewed one of the decorative crystal teardrops and embedded the lens directly into the brass housing, splicing the microscopic power feed into the chandelier's main electrical line. I repeated this painstaking process in the formal dining room, the expansive chef's kitchen, the library, and finally the master suite upstairs. Every angle of the home was now covered in ultra-high-definition video. The lenses were entirely invisible to the naked eye, yet capable of capturing the slightest twitch of a guilty muscle or the nervous sweat forming on a liar's forehead. But seeing their triumph was not enough. I needed to hear every desperate, greedy word they whispered when they thought they were alone and victorious. I moved to the walls, utilizing a laser drill to pierce pinpoint holes into the pristine drywall. I fed directional audio receivers into the cavities, angling them precisely to bounce sound waves off the hardwood floors. These microphones were sensitive enough to pick up a racing heartbeat from across the room. I spent hours crawling under floorboards and snaking wires behind heavy mahogany bookshelves, ensuring there was absolutely no dead air in the entire estate. If Jasmine giggled about stealing my life, it would be recorded in pristine, lossless audio. The foundation of logic. As I ran a spool of fiber optic cable along the baseboards of the upstairs hallway, my hands coated in fine white plaster dust, the sharp smell of the raw copper wire triggered a memory I had buried for over a decade. I was 16 years old again, shivering in the unheated detached garage of Calvin's sprawling pastoral estate. I had dragged an old discarded dining chair out there, hunched over a broken laptop I had salvaged from a neighborhood electronics recycling bin. The screen had a massive spiderweb crack running down the center, and the battery was completely dead, forcing me to keep it plugged into a faulty extension cord. I was teaching myself basic coding, squinting at the fragmented text, desperate to build something that belonged solely to me, entirely separate from the suffocating pressure of my father's expectations. Calvin had walked into the freezing garage looking for his golf clubs. He was wearing one of his custom-tailored silk suits smelling of expensive cologne and absolute unquestionable authority. He stopped behind my chair looking down at the flickering screen with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "What are you doing wasting electricity on that garbage?" Calvin had demanded, kicking the leg of my chair so hard it jarred my teeth. "I am learning to code," I told him, keeping my voice steady, despite the fear gnawing heavily in my stomach. "It is how digital architecture is built. It is important." Calvin let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the concrete walls. He reached down and yanked the extension cord right out of the wall socket. My screen went instantly black. The lines of code I had spent hours painstakingly writing vanished into the dark void. "Digital architecture is for laborers, Maya," he sneered, looking at me like I was a stain on his immaculate life. "Real power does not come from a broken screen in a freezing garage. Real power comes from the pulpit. It comes from commanding a room, from making people believe in your vision without question. You are hiding behind a machine because you completely lack the charisma to lead. You are wasting your life on a toy while your sister is out networking with families who actually matter. Stop playing with garbage and do something useful with your time." I sat in the dark garage long after he went back into his warm, brightly lit mansion. He truly believed that power was purely vocal, that charisma could conquer any obstacle. He looked at my broken laptop and saw a toy. He looked at me and saw a total failure. I snapped back to the present, tightening the final audio node into the baseboard of my master bedroom. My hands were perfectly steady. Calvin had mocked the code I wrote in that freezing garage. He had no idea that the very same foundation of logic and digital architecture he dismissed as garbage was currently woven into the fabric of his megachurch waiting to detonate. And it was now woven into the very walls of the house he was planning to steal, sealing the vault. With the audio and visual surveillance completely integrated, I moved on to the environmental controls. The Buckhead Manor was outfitted with top-of-the-line commercial smart home technology. I bypassed the standard user interface and accessed the raw operating system of the house itself. I rewrote the security protocols for the heavy, reinforced oak front doors. The factory setting allowed the doors to be manually unlocked from the inside, a standard fire safety feature. I coded a hard override. Once the digital perimeter was breached and the alarm was silently triggered, the internal deadbolts would engage with industrial magnetic force. The doors would lock entirely from the outside. No manual twisting of the interior knob would open them. The windows on the ground floor were already shatterproof hurricane glass, a security measure I had installed months ago for my own peace of mind. Now they served a dark dual purpose. Once Jasmine Preston and Calvin stepped inside to claim their stolen prize, they would not be able to leave until I explicitly decided the show was over. They were walking into a vault. I finished the physical trap by calibrating the exterior motion sensors. I did not just want to catch them inside, I wanted to capture the exact moment of their arrival. I rigged the massive perimeter floodlights to trigger the moment a vehicle breached the front gates. The house would be bathed in an intense cinematic glow, perfectly illuminating their greedy, triumphant faces as they walked up to the front door to retrieve the key I had promised to leave under the mat. Every step they took would be documented. Every smug smile would be recorded. The test run. It was the afternoon of Christmas Eve. The trap was fully set. I wiped the plaster dust from my jeans and walked down to the hidden reinforced panic room situated below the wine cellar. This was my central control center, a room they did not even know existed. I sat down in the command chair and flipped the massive master power switch. The wall in front of me lit up. 12 high-definition monitors sparked to life, feeding a steady stream of data and video directly into my console. I initiated a system-wide diagnostic check. Monitor 1 displayed the crisp 4K feed from the grand foyer chandelier. Monitor 2 showed the luxurious master suite perfectly staged to look as though I had packed in a hurry. Monitor 3 isolated the audio frequencies in the dining room, the sound waves registering as flat, steady green lines in the absolute silence of the empty house. I tapped a command on my keyboard to test the exterior floodlights. On Monitor 4, the front driveway was instantly flooded with blinding daylight balanced illumination. I leaned back and looked at the center monitor. My own face stared back at me, captured perfectly by a hidden lens in the control room mirror. I looked exhausted, my clothes covered in dust and drywall, but my eyes were sharp and alive with a dangerous electric energy. I ran the final lock sequence. A heavy, synchronized mechanical thud echoed through the floorboards above me as every single deadbolt in the mansion slammed shut simultaneously. The system was flawless. The digital fortress was armed and operational. I pulled up the live feed of the Sanctuary of Grace broadcasting network on a side screen. The countdown timer to the midnight service was ticking away. My phone sat silent on the console. They thought I was gone. They thought the house was theirs for the taking. I rested my hands on the console, watching the empty driveway on the security feed. I had the cameras, I had the locks, and I had the absolute truth loaded into a digital warhead. Now I just needed my audience to arrive. I pulled the collar of my wool coat tight against the biting December wind as I navigated the subterranean parking garage of the Atlanta Metro News Broadcasting Center. My boots echoed sharply against the concrete. It was Christmas Eve morning, and the massive structure was practically a ghost town. The network was running on a skeleton crew for the holiday, which was exactly the kind of sterile, isolated environment I needed. I bypassed the main security desk, utilizing a generic visitor badge my best friend had left for me in a magnetic lockbox near the service elevator. I rode the car up to the 7th floor, stepping out into a labyrinth of soundproofed production studios. I walked straight to Editing Bay 4, a windowless room buried deep in the center of the building, and pushed the heavy acoustic door open. Kendra was sitting at the primary editing console, illuminated by the harsh, multicolored glow of 3 massive playback monitors. She was tapping a manicured fingernail against her ceramic coffee mug, her eyes sharp and completely awake despite the early hour. Kendra and I had been roommates during our freshman year of college. She had watched me scrape together pennies to buy ramen, while my parents fully funded Jasmine's luxury apartment across town. She was a relentless, award-winning investigative journalist who specialized in corporate corruption, and she possessed a deep, abiding hatred for hypocrites who used religion as a shield for greed. Sitting on the small leather sofa in the corner of the room was Detective Marcus Jordan. He looked exactly how a financial crimes investigator for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation should look. He wore a rumpled gray trench coat, a tie that had been loosened hours ago, and an expression of permanent, heavy exhaustion. He had been trying to nail Calvin for tax evasion and corporate fraud for the better part of 5 years. 2 years ago, Jordan had gotten close, subpoenaing the church's vendor records. Calvin had responded by going on local television and accusing Jordan of leading a racially motivated witch hunt against a prominent black enterprise, effectively killing the investigation and nearly ruining Jordan's career. Jordan wanted Calvin behind bars just as badly as I did. You look like you have not slept since November, Maya, Kendra said, swiveling her chair around to face me. Tell me you brought something good. My news director is breathing down my neck about the ratings slump, and I promised him a Christmas miracle. I walked over to the steel workstation, reaching into the inner pocket of my coat. I pulled out the encrypted flash drive and set it down on the desk with a heavy metallic clack. I brought you the entire kingdom, I said, looking directly at the detective. Everything you need to put my father and my brother-in-law in a federal penitentiary for the next 2 decades. Jordan stood up, his posture shifting instantly from weary to hyper-focused. He walked over to the console towering over Kendra. Plug it into a sterile machine, he instructed, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. I want to see the routing data first. Kendra grabbed a designated offline laptop, a machine completely disconnected from the network, to prevent any accidental data leaks or tracking beacons. She inserted the drive. I leaned over her shoulder, typing in my 32-character decryption key. The screen went black for a fraction of a second before exploding into a cascading waterfall of digital folders. Open the directory labeled Sanctuary Building Fund, I told her. Kendra double-clicked the folder. The screen populated with the raw financial ledgers I had extracted from the church's internal servers. I walked them through the architecture of the embezzlement. I showed them the $12 million systematically drained from the tax-exempt accounts over the last 3 years. I showed them the 3 shell LLCs acting as the corporate recipients. I showed them the cross-reference tax identification numbers, proving that Preston was the sole proprietor of those failing commercial real estate ventures. This is flawless digital forensics, Maya. Kendra breathed, her eyes scanning the columns of stolen money. This is textbook money laundering. They were using the congregation's tithes as a personal bailout fund. It is incredible data, Jordan admitted, leaning closer to the screen, tracing the transaction dates with a thick finger. But data is cold. Data lacks a voice. In a federal courtroom, defense attorneys do not argue the numbers. They argue the narrative. Calvin will hire the best legal defense team on the Eastern Seaboard. They will look at these routing numbers and they will build a firewall around the pastor. They will claim Preston was acting as a rogue agent, a desperate son-in-law who abused his access to the church's accounts without Calvin's knowledge. I thought of that, I said, tapping the keyboard to open the next folder. Open the document labeled Executive Communications. The blank subject line email appeared on the screen. The frantic, terrified message from Preston begging for a $700,000 wire transfer to stop his personal bankruptcy. And directly beneath it, Calvin's damning reply. I have protected you as long as I can to keep my daughter happy, but we are entirely out of capital. Fix your own mess or I will let the bank bury you. I watched Jordan read the exchange. I expected him to smile. I expected him to pull out his handcuffs and declare the case closed. Instead, he sighed heavily, rubbing a hand across his jaw. It is not enough, Jordan said, his voice stripped of all optimism. Kendra spun around, glaring at him. Are you blind, Marcus? The pastor is literally admitting to covering up the financial deficit to protect his spoiled daughter. It is right there in black and white. It is right there in digital text, Jordan corrected sharply. Digital text that a high-powered defense attorney will claim was taken entirely out of context. They will argue that Calvin was talking about legitimate high-risk church investments that failed, not admitting to active embezzlement. They will say the phrase protected you meant he was shielding Preston from internal board criticism, not criminal prosecution. Maya, you have given me the absolute best circumstantial map of a crime I have ever seen. But against a man with Calvin's public influence, a man who will claim you hacked his servers just to frame him because you are a disgruntled, estranged daughter, this is not a guaranteed conviction. Jordan turned to face me, his expression deadly serious. I know he did it. You know he did it. But to put him in handcuffs and ensure he never sees the inside of a pulpit again, I cannot just bring a jury, spreadsheets, and emails. I need a confession. I need Calvin's own voice in an undeniable context, admitting that he stole that money and that he planned to steal your house to cover his tracks. Without a confession, he will slip right through our fingers again. The room fell completely silent. The heavy soundproof walls of the editing bay seemed to press inward. Kendra looked at me, her usual fierce confidence wavering. She knew how dangerous my father was when cornered. I did not flinch. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick roll of architectural blueprints, slamming them down on the desk right next to the laptop. I unrolled the thick blue paper, smoothing it flat under the harsh studio lights. "You want a confession, detective?" I asked, my voice dropping to a cold, predatory whisper. "I am going to hand you one on a silver platter." Jordan frowned, looking down at the blueprints. "What is this?" "These are the floor plans to my $4 million estate in Buckhead," I explained, tracing my finger over the sprawling layout of the first floor. "Yesterday afternoon, I sent my family a message telling them I surrender. I told them my business was collapsing. I could not afford a lawyer and I was terrified of going to prison for their crime. I told them I was abandoning the property and leaving the keys under the mat today." Kendra's eyes widened, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across her face as she realized exactly what I was doing. "You played dead." "I played the exact role they have always expected me to play," I corrected. "The frightened, weak utility who takes the fall so they can maintain their luxury." They took the bait instantly. They believe the house is currently empty and waiting for them. I pointed to the red tactical markers I had drawn all over the blueprints. "I spent the last 3 days turning the entire estate into a digital black site. There are microscopic 4K cameras embedded in the crystal chandeliers. There are directional audio receivers hidden behind the drywall, calibrated to pick up a whisper from 40 feet away. The exterior floodlights are tied to motion sensors at the front gate." Jordan was staring at the blueprints, his law enforcement brain rapidly calculating the legal and tactical implications of what I was describing. "You bugged your own home." "I secured my own property," I countered smoothly. "I then reprogrammed the commercial smart locks on the reinforced oak front doors. When the exterior alarm is tripped, the internal deadbolts engage with an industrial magnetic lock. They lock entirely from the outside. Once they step inside to claim their stolen prize, they cannot leave." I looked back at the laptop screen, pointing to the encrypted files. "At midnight tonight, I am broadcasting these financial ledgers and this email exchange directly into the Sanctuary of Grace's live Christmas Eve service. But before I burn his public image to the ground, Calvin is going to walk into my house believing he has successfully destroyed my life. He is going to stand in my foyer with Preston and Jasmine, and they are going to celebrate. They are going to talk about how easy it was to frame me. They are going to laugh about the stolen $12 million. I locked eyes with the detective. "They are going to give you your confession, Marcus, in high-definition video and lossless audio broadcast directly to my secure server." Jordan stared at the floor plans, tracing the perimeter of the manor with his index finger. He shook his head, a mixture of profound shock and deep, professional respect washing over his face. "They're really going to break in on Christmas Eve?" Jordan asked, his voice hushed. I smiled. "They won't just break in. They're going to pop champagne. Just be there at 5 p.m. The clock in the grand hallway chimed a soft, resonant melody, signaling 5:15. The winter sun was already dipping below the tree line, casting long, sharp shadows across the Brazilian cherry hardwood floors of the Buckhead Manor. I stood perfectly still in the center of the expansive living room, my breathing slow and controlled. Below my feet, deep in the hidden panic room, the server arrays were humming, recording every silent second. Across the city, Kendra and Detective Jordan were watching the live feed. The trap was armed. The digital perimeter was active. Now I just needed to play the victim one last time. The crunch of expensive tires on the gravel driveway broke the absolute silence of the estate. A heavy car door slammed shut, followed by another and then another. I heard the muffled, confident voices of my family approaching the front porch. They were not sneaking in. They were not approaching with the caution of thieves. They were walking up the front steps with the loud, arrogant entitlement of conquerors claiming their spoils. I heard the scrape of the key sliding into the front door lock. The key I had obediently left under the welcome mat, exactly as I had promised in my message of surrender. The heavy brass tumblers turned with a sharp click. The massive oak double doors swung open, letting in a blast of freezing December air. I immediately dropped my posture. The cold, hardened focus I had maintained for 3 days evaporated in an instant. I let my shoulders slump forward, rounding my spine to make myself appear physically smaller. I widened my eyes, forcing a panicked, rapid rhythm into my breathing. I backed away from the foyer, retreating into the center of the living room, directly beneath the crystal chandelier housing the primary 4K optical lens. Valerie stepped into the foyer first. My mother was dressed in a pristine white cashmere coat, her sharp eyes immediately darting around the immaculate entryway, assessing the cleanliness of the space. She did not look at me. She looked at the imported marble tiles, checking for scuff marks. Jasmine followed close behind her, shivering dramatically as she clutched the lapels of her designer trench coat. Preston trailed her, carrying a leather overnight bag. Calvin entered last. He stepped over the threshold with the slow, deliberate stride of a king entering a conquered territory. He reached back and pushed the heavy oak doors shut. The moment the doors met the frame, a deep, resonant, mechanical thud echoed through the walls. It was the sound of the industrial magnetic deadbolts engaging, locking the doors entirely from the outside. The factory safety overrides were officially dead. The vault was sealed. Calvin did not even register the sound. He was too busy looking at me, his lips curling into a smile of absolute predatory satisfaction. "Well, look at this," Calvin said, his booming pastoral voice filling the cavernous room. "I was beginning to think you were going to make us drag you out of here by your hair, Maya. It is good to see you finally learned how to be obedient." I took another step back, wrapping my arms around my torso as if trying to shield myself from his gaze. I forced my hands to tremble visibly. "I told you I was leaving," I said, pitching my voice an octave higher, letting it crack with simulated fear. "My bags are packed in the kitchen. I am waiting for my ride to the airport." Preston laughed, a sharp nasal sound that echoed off the high ceilings. He dropped his leather bag onto the pristine white sofa and walked directly toward the custom-built wet bar tucked into the alcove of the living room. He moved with the complete confidence of a man who believed he owned every square inch of the property. "Your ride to the airport," Preston mocked, stepping behind the bar and pulling a crystal decanter of my most expensive bourbon from the top shelf. "Where exactly are you flying to, Maya? Because unless you are booking a one-way ticket to a country without an extradition treaty, you are going to have a very hard time starting over. Your credit is completely annihilated." Preston poured a generous measure of the amber liquid into a glass, not bothering to offer anyone else a drink. He took a long sip, letting out a satisfied sigh before turning back to face me. He wanted to gloat. He needed to hear himself speak his victory aloud, which was exactly what the hidden directional microphones required. "You really thought a couple of federal firewall contracts made you untouchable," Preston continued, swirling the bourbon in his glass as he walked toward the center of the room. "You thought you were so much smarter than us because you know how to write code. But you do not understand how real leverage works. It was almost pathetic how easy it was to crush your little business." "Please," I whispered, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. "You already took the house. You won. Just leave my company alone." "The company is already dead," Preston bragged, his voice dripping with arrogance. "A few well-placed phone calls to my friends on the banking commission, and your lines of credit evaporated in 24 hours. We filed 3 anonymous complaints with the Federal Trade Commission regarding your data security protocols. Your clients panicked exactly like I knew they would. You are toxic, Maya. No one is going to hire a cybersecurity firm that is under federal investigation for gross negligence. We squeezed the oxygen right out of your lungs, and you did not even see it coming until you were suffocating." I kept my head down, hiding the dark satisfaction blooming in my chest. "Keep talking, Preston. Give the detective every single detail." Jasmine sighed loudly, completely ignoring her husband's confession of corporate sabotage. She unbuttoned her trench coat and began pacing the perimeter of the living room, her eyes scanning the architectural details with blatant disgust. The sharp clack of her designer heels against the wood provided a steady rhythmic backbeat to her complaints. "These floors have to go, Preston," Jasmine announced, stopping to scuff the toe of her shoe against the polished wood. "They are entirely too dark. It feels like a cave in here. I cannot believe you lived like this, Maya. It is incredibly depressing. We need French oak, something light and airy. This Brazilian cherry is just tacky. We can rip them out next week, sweetheart, Preston assured her, taking another sip of bourbon. We have the budget for a full renovation now that we have secured the asset. Valerie finally walked fully into the room, stopping a few feet away from where I stood trembling. She looked me up and down, her expression a mask of cold maternal disappointment. She was not gloating like Preston or complaining like Jasmine. She was simply assessing me as a nuisance that needed to be swept away. "Did you clean the appliances before you packed your bags?" Valerie asked, her tone flat and demanding. "I will not have Jasmine moving into a filthy kitchen, and I assume you left the master suite in acceptable condition. We do not want to hire a commercial removal service for your leftovers." "The house is clean," I stammered, wrapping my arms tighter around myself. "I took everything that belonged to me." "Nothing here belongs to you anymore," Calvin corrected smoothly, stepping forward to join his wife. He placed a heavy manicured hand on Valerie's shoulder, projecting the image of a united, righteous front. He looked around the grand living room, soaking in the vaulted ceilings and the expensive finishes. He was taking inventory of his new kingdom. "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away, Maya," Calvin preached, letting his voice drop into the familiar commanding cadence he used on Sunday mornings. "You chose to rebel against this family. You chose to disrespect the hierarchy God put in place. You thought you could rise above us, that you could flaunt your wealth while your sister struggled. This is simply the consequence of your pride. We are merely correcting a cosmic imbalance. The wealth of the wicked is stored up for the righteous." He actually believed it. He had twisted his own greed into a divine mandate, convincing himself that stealing his daughter's home was an act of holy retribution. I looked up at him, letting a single carefully calibrated tear track down my cheek. I forced my breathing to become ragged and shallow, the picture of a woman entirely broken by the weight of her family's betrayal. I took one final step backward, ensuring I was positioned perfectly in the center of the room, the audio receivers picking up every subtle shift in my voice. "I understand that you hate me," I said, my voice barely louder than a whisper, trembling violently. "I understand that you want me to fail, but I do not understand how you could go this far." I looked directly into Calvin's eyes, dropping the hook right into the water. "How could you forge those church documents to steal my home? What if you get caught?" The silence in the room was absolute, shattered only by the soft confirming ping of my phone. The phantom override sequence was initiated. I slipped the device back into my pocket, keeping my eyes locked on Calvin. "What did you just do?" Preston asked, his voice losing its confident swagger, replaced by a sudden sharp edge of panic. He took a step toward me, his hands balling into fists. "I asked you a question, Maya. What did you just press?" "I just started the sermon," I replied, my voice completely stripped of the manufactured fear ringing clear and cold in the cavernous room. Calvin's jaw tightened. "You are not making any sense. The midnight broadcast does not begin for another 5 hours. The media team is doing sound checks. Get your bags and leave." I did not move. I stood my ground, feeling the solid weight of the Brazilian cherry floors beneath my boots. "They are doing sound checks," I agreed calmly. "But they are not going to be broadcasting your face tonight, Calvin. The entire network architecture of the Sanctuary of Grace has just been hijacked. Right now, on every massive LED screen inside your megachurch, on the homepage of your website, and across all 3 satellite television networks, your congregation is not looking at an empty stage." I watched the blood slowly drain from Valerie's face. She dropped her white cashmere coat back onto the chair, her perfectly manicured hands beginning to shake. "They are looking at a highly detailed automated presentation." I continued, pacing slowly toward the wet bar. "They are reading the internal routing numbers of the Sanctuary Building Fund. They are watching a graphic animation that traces exactly how $4 million moved from the church's tax-exempt accounts into Preston's Shell LLC in Delaware. They are looking at the forged commercial lease agreement side by side with the default notices on Preston's Midtown real estate developments." Jasmine let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. "You're lying," she whispered, her voice trembling. You don't have that information. The church servers are encrypted. I built the encryption, Jasmine, I reminded her smoothly. I designed the firewalls you thought were protecting your theft. I walked through them 3 days ago while you were picking out new hardwood floors for my house. I turned my attention back to Calvin. The arrogant king of the megachurch was staring at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The color had vanished from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. But the best part of the broadcast, I said, leaning casually against the granite countertop, is the final slide. It is a blown-up high-definition screenshot of the email exchange between you and Preston. The one where he begs for a bailout to stop his personal bankruptcy. The one where you explicitly admit to draining $12 million from the congregation to protect Jasmine's lifestyle. I set the presentation on a continuous, unskippable loop. Your media team is completely locked out of the control panels. They cannot cut the feed. They cannot turn off the projectors. Every single person in that sanctuary is reading your confession right now. Shut it down! Calvin roared, his voice cracking with sheer, unfiltered panic. He lunged toward me, his hands reaching out as if he could physically strangle the code out of my throat. Shut it down right now, Maya. You are destroying everything I have built. I didn't flinch. I didn't back away. I stared right into his furious, terrified eyes. I didn't destroy it, Calvin. You did. I just turned on the lights. Preston pulled his phone from his pocket, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. He tapped frantically at the screen, trying to pull up the church's website. I watched his face contort in absolute horror as the live feed loaded. He's right. Preston choked out, his voice barely a squeak. It's all there. The routing numbers, the LLC documents, my emails. It's broadcasting live. There are thousands of people in the chat. He dropped the phone, staring at me as if I had just morphed into a monster. You're going to federal prison for this. This is cyber terrorism. It's whistleblowing, I corrected sharply. And I won't be the one wearing handcuffs tonight. I looked up at the crystal chandelier hanging above us. Did you get all of that, Detective Jordan? Because I think Preston's detailed explanation of the Delaware Shell LLC was incredibly thorough. Calvin stopped dead in his tracks. Valerie grabbed his arm, her eyes darting around the pristine living room like a trapped animal. Who are you talking to? Valerie demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. Maya, what have you done? I told you I was learning to build digital architecture, I said softly, the memory of that freezing garage flashing in my mind. I just built a prison right around you. I pointed to the chandelier, then to the laser-drilled holes in the drywall near the bookshelves. There are 4K optical lenses hidden in this room alone. There are directional audio receivers behind the drywall calibrated to pick up a whisper. Everything you just said, Preston's step-by-step breakdown of the forgery, Calvin's admission about the missing $12 million you're gloating about stealing my home, it wasn't just recorded, it was streamed live to a secure server managed by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. The silence in the room was deafening. It was the sound of 4 people simultaneously realizing their lives were over. The doors locked magnetically when you closed them, I explained, watching Calvin rush toward the heavy oak double doors. He grabbed the handles and pulled with all his strength, but the reinforced wood did not budge a single millimeter. He pounded his fists against the door, his pastoral dignity completely shattered. They won't open, I said, walking toward the center of the room. And the windows are shatterproof hurricane glass. You are not leaving. Suddenly, the massive exterior floodlights guarding the driveway blazed to life, casting harsh, blinding light through the front windows. The red and blue flashes of police sirens began strobing against the glass, painting the living room in the chaotic colors of an active crime scene. You always told me that real power comes from commanding a room, Calvin, I said, my voice rising over the approaching wail of the sirens. You said I lacked the charisma to lead because I hid behind a machine. I looked at my family huddled together in the foyer, terrified, trapped, and completely ruined. You were wrong, I whispered. I don't need charisma to destroy you. I just needed you to talk. Calvin threw his head back and laughed. It was a deep, resonant sound that had commanded thousands of parishioners for decades, now echoing with pure, unfiltered arrogance in my living room. He looked at me as if I had just asked the most absurd question imaginable. "Get caught," Calvin mocked, stepping closer until he loomed over me, bringing the sharp scent of his expensive cologne with him. "I am the Church Maya. Preston and I move millions through those accounts every single quarter. Nobody questions a man of God. They write their checks, they bow their heads, and they thank me for the privilege of funding my vision. You truly think any federal auditor is going to take down a pillar of the community over a stubborn college dropout?" Valerie let out a long, exasperated sigh, adjusting her pristine cashmere coat. "Stop being so dramatic, Maya. This is exactly why you failed in the first place. You completely lack vision. You should just be happy your sister is finally getting the luxury she deserves, instead of throwing a tantrum over a house you could not hold on to." Preston swirled the bourbon in his glass, too eager to prove his own twisted genius to keep his mouth shut. "It was almost too easy," he bragged, taking another sip and pacing the floor. "I drafted a commercial lease agreement, backdated it 18 months, and registered a Delaware LLC under a proxy name. We routed the church building funds directly into the holding account, claiming it was for a new community outreach center. Then I just transferred the deed of your house to the LLC to cover the supposed default. Flawless paper trail. You never stood a chance against real corporate strategy." I absorbed every word, every arrogant boast, every admission of guilt, every specific detail of their financial crimes spoken aloud in the dead center of my acoustic trap. The trembling in my hands ceased instantly. My rounded shoulders snapped back, my spine straightening as the terrified broken facade completely dissolved. I looked at the three of them, no longer a victim, but the architect of their absolute destruction. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and tapped the single red button glowing on the screen. A loud, heavy, synchronized metallic thud echoed through the manor as the secondary locking mechanisms engaged. The room plunged into absolute darkness for a fraction of a second before the massive stadium-level floodlights I had rigged outside snapped on. Blinding daylight white illumination blasted through the shatterproof windows, throwing stark, aggressive shadows across the imported hardwood floors. The heavy oak doors of the formal dining room swung open. Kendra stepped out into the blinding light. She was wearing a sharp crimson blazer, holding a microphone bearing the Atlanta Metro News logo. Right behind her was her lead cameraman, a heavy broadcast rig hoisted on his shoulder, the bright red live light glowing ominously in the dim interior of the house. From the shadows of the opposite hallway, Detective Jordan stepped forward, accompanied by 4 heavily armed uniformed police officers. Calvin's confident million-dollar smile instantly vanished. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. The reality of the glowing red camera light and the tactical police vests hit him like a physical blow. He staggered backward, bumping into Valerie. Preston dropped his crystal glass. It shattered against the Brazilian cherry floors, sending expensive bourbon splashing across the wood. Complete panic erupted. Preston did not hesitate. He spun around and sprinted toward the kitchen, desperate to reach the back patio doors. He made it exactly 4 steps before 2 uniformed officers lunged forward. They tackled him hard against the granite kitchen island. The sickening thud of his chest hitting the stone echoed through the open floor plan. Handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists. True to his cowardly, self-serving nature, Preston instantly turned on his father-in-law. "It was his idea," Preston screamed, his voice cracking with sheer terror as an officer hauled him to his feet. "He forged the deeds. He used the church money. I was just following his orders. He threatened to bankrupt me if I did not help him launder the building funds." Calvin watched his son-in-law squeal on live television. He desperately tried to salvage his crumbling empire. He puffed out his chest, attempting to use his famous pastoral voice to command the room. "Detective Jordan, this is a massive misunderstanding," Calvin boomed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "My daughter is deeply disturbed. She has orchestrated this entire charade to extort me. I demand that you leave my property immediately." Detective Jordan did not even blink. He walked calmly across the room, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "Calvin Wilson." Jordan said, his voice a low, authoritative rumble that completely overpowered the pastor's frantic preaching. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud conspiracy to commit forgery and grand larceny." Jordan grabbed Calvin's wrist, spinning him around and snapping the cuffs shut with a satisfying metallic click. Jasmine dropped to the floor, her designer trench coat pooling around her as she threw a massive theatrical tantrum. She pounded her fists against the hardwood, screaming hysterically about her ruined Christmas, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband and father were facing decades in federal prison. Valerie shrank back against the wall, desperately trying to hide her face behind her oversized Birkin bag to block the glare of the news camera. She scrambled toward me, completely abandoning her husband and her daughter. "Maya, please!" Valerie begged, her voice a frantic, desperate hiss. "Call off the police. Tell the reporter to turn off the camera. Think of our reputation. Think of the family name. We can fix this quietly." I looked down at my mother. She was not begging for her husband's freedom. She was begging for her social standing. She only ever cared about public perception. "You wanted a family gathering for Christmas?" I said, my voice ringing clear and cold across the chaotic room. "I just invited the whole city." The uniformed officers hauled Calvin and Preston out the front door, Frog marching them down the long driveway toward the waiting squad cars. The red and blue lights painted the manicured lawn in strobing, frantic colors. I turned my attention back to Jasmine, who was still sobbing on the floor, and Valerie, who was shaking with humiliation. I pointed toward the open front doors, letting the freezing winter wind whip through the foyer. "Failures do not belong in my family," I told them, echoing the exact cruelty Calvin had inflicted on me for years. "Get off my property." They had no leverage. They had no power. Valerie grabbed Jasmine by the arm, dragging her up from the floor. They walked out of the house, shivering violently in the freezing December air. I watched from the warmth of my foyer as the two women who had mocked my existence stood on the icy curb, desperately tapping their phones, forced to wait in the dark for an Uber, while the police cars drove away with their financial security. I closed the heavy oak doors and engaged the magnetic locks, sealing out the cold and the toxic residue of my past. The next morning brought a profound, unbroken silence to the Buckhead Manor. It was Christmas Day. I woke up in my own bed in my own house, completely untouchable. I walked downstairs in a thick robe and turned on the massive television in the living room. The news was everywhere. Kendra had delivered an absolute masterpiece. The morning broadcasts were playing the looped audio and video of Calvin and Preston explicitly confessing to their crimes in my living room, perfectly synced with the financial documents I had projected onto the megachurch screens. The fallout was instantaneous and absolute. The Sanctuary of Grace Board of Directors held an emergency midnight session and officially stripped Calvin of his pastoral title, permanently revoking his pension. The federal prosecutor announced that Preston was facing a minimum of 10 years in a maximum security penitentiary for orchestrating the Shell LLC fraud. Jasmine and Valerie had become instant social pariahs in Atlanta's elite circles. Their bank accounts were frozen by federal investigators, completely cutting them off from the funds they had stolen. The empire of lies was reduced to ash. I walked into the kitchen and brewed a fresh pot of espresso. The house smelled of expensive coffee and absolute freedom. I carried my mug into the living room and sat down in a plush leather armchair positioned right beside the grand marble fireplace. The flames cracked and hissed, radiating a deep, comforting heat. I watched the winter sunrise paint the Atlanta skyline in brilliant shades of gold and violet through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I picked up my phone and opened my secure financial dashboard. The stock portfolio for my cybersecurity firm was surging, client contracts renewing and expanding, following the massive, very public demonstration of my digital fortification skills. I smiled, taking a long, slow sip of my coffee. I opened my contacts list, selected Valerie, Jasmine, Calvin, and Preston, and permanently blocked their numbers. For the first time in my entire life, I enjoyed a truly peaceful Christmas. The true measure of your worth is never determined by those who try to diminish you. Maya's journey teaches us that toxic family dynamics and betrayal do not have to dictate your future. Instead of shrinking to fit their cruel expectations, she used her unique skills, resilience, and quiet intelligence to reclaim her power. The story proves that blood does not guarantee loyalty, and true security comes from independence and self-belief. When you stop seeking validation from those who only want to use you, you create the space to build a life of genuine peace and undeniable success. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic people to protect your own peace? And how did it change your life? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more empowering journeys.